Imagine for a moment that you are flying at 10,000 meters above the ground. The sky is blue, the horizon fades into the distance, and beneath you there is nothing but ocean. Suddenly, the enormous belly of a war airship begins to open, and from it, slowly, a fighter plane emerges. It does not fall. It does not crash. It flies, alone, in the middle of the open sky. What you just imagined is not science fiction. It happened. It was real. And for nearly 2 decades, the brightest military minds of the 20th century bet everything, their entire budget, their entire technology, and the lives of their men, on the idea that this would change aerial warfare forever. It did not. And the reason it failed is far more fascinating than the reason it was ever built. Today you are going to discover the story of the parasite aircraft carriers, those colossal flying machines that transported fighter planes inside their fuselage, launched them in the middle of battle, and then attempted to recover them back in midair. A concept so bold, so absurd, and so brilliant at the same time, that it could only have been born in the most creative and dangerous era of military aviation. And most importantly, you are going to understand exactly why it failed. Not for lack of courage, not for lack of ingenuity, but because the very nature of physics, of combat, and of war itself imposed its will over the dreams of those who believed they could redefine the limits of the sky. Stay until the end, because the final chapter of this story contains a lesson that military engineers took decades to learn, and one that still echoes today in the design of the most advanced weapons systems on the planet. It was the 1920s. The world had just emerged from the First World War with wounds still fresh and one absolute certainty burned into the minds of military strategists. Control of the air was everything. Whoever dominated the sky dominated the battlefield. But there was one enormous problem. The fighter aircraft of that era had very limited flight range. They could take off, engage in combat for a relatively short period of time, and then had to return to base. This meant that vast areas of the planet, especially over oceans and deep enemy territory, were simply out of reach. They were blind spots on the chessboard of aerial warfare, and military commanders looked at them with a mixture of frustration and obsession. The solution they came up with was, in objective terms, one of the most daring ideas the human mind has ever produced in times of war. If the aircraft cannot reach the target on its own, they reasoned, then let us carry the aircraft to where it needs to be. Inside a larger aircraft. One that does have the necessary range. That is how the concept of the parasite aircraft carrier was born. A large aircraft capable of transporting one or more smaller fighter planes inside its fuselage, carrying them to the vicinity of the target, releasing them in midair to carry out their mission, and then recovering them again in flight before returning to base. The concept, on paper, was elegant, almost perfect. It eliminated in a single stroke the problem of flight range, extended the reach of aerial operations to previously unthinkable distances, and allowed surprise attacks to be launched from directions and altitudes unexpected by the enemy. On paper, because what happened when real tests began was a completely different story. A story of turbulence, of accidents, of physical limitations impossible to overcome, and of tactical decisions that, with the passage of time, proved to be fundamental errors of concept. But to understand why it failed, you first need to understand exactly how it worked. The process of launching an aircraft from another aircraft in midair was, in itself, an extraordinary feat of engineering. The carrier aircraft flew at a constant altitude and speed, maintaining as much stability as possible. In its belly, held in place by a system of hooks and metal arms, the fighter plane waited. When the moment came, the pilot of the smaller aircraft started his engine inside the bay, checked his instruments, and then the holding mechanism released him. For a fraction of a second, the small plane dropped. Just a fraction. Then its wings caught the air, the engine responded, and the pilot took control. He flew free, alone in the sky, far from the metal belly that had carried him there. Up to that point, the system worked. The problem came afterward, because recovering that aircraft, returning it to the interior of the carrier plane in midair, was an operation of absolutely enormous complexity and danger. The fighter pilot had to approach the mothership from behind and below, reduce his speed until it matched exactly that of the carrier aircraft, and then, with surgical precision, hook his plane onto a metal trapeze hanging from the belly of the larger aircraft while both vehicles flew at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Any miscalculation, any unexpected gust of wind, any minimal variation in the speed of either aircraft could result in a direct collision. And a collision at that speed and at that altitude gave no second chances. The pilots who participated in these tests were not ordinary men. They were the most experienced and skilled aviators of their generation. And even so, the number of accidents during training was alarming. The turbulence generated by the carrier aircraft itself created zones of extremely unstable air precisely where the fighter pilot needed to maneuver with the greatest precision. It was like trying to thread a needle while someone violently shakes your hand. But the accidents during testing were only the first layer of the problem. Beneath it lay something more fundamental, something that no additional training and no technical improvement could ever fully resolve. The space available inside the carrier aircraft was limited. Severely limited, and that space determined in absolute terms the size of the aircraft that could be transported within it. The fighters had to be small, very small, so small that their reduced dimensions imposed physical restrictions that were impossible to ignore. To begin with, fuel. A small aircraft cannot carry much fuel, and without sufficient fuel, the range of the fighter once launched was minimal. Which meant that after all the colossal effort of transporting it to the vicinity of the target, the combat aircraft only had minutes in the air before needing to return to the carrier ship. Minutes in which it had to locate the enemy, attack, defend itself, and then execute the dangerous recovery maneuver. In real combat, those minutes were not enough. They never were. And fuel was not the only problem. The reduced space also drastically limited the electronic systems that could be installed on board. The radar systems of the era, already bulky and heavy, simply did not fit inside those small fighters, which meant that the pilots flew essentially blind from an electronic standpoint, relying solely on their own eyes to detect threats in a combat environment that was becoming increasingly technological and complex. And if radar did not fit, advanced weaponry did not either. The microfighters could carry light armament, perhaps sufficient for combat in another era, but absolutely insufficient against the modern enemy aircraft they would encounter in a real theater of operations. They were, in the words of the very pilots who flew them, test aircraft disguised as warplanes. But there was one more problem, one that surpassed all the others in gravity, one that affected not the small fighter, but the enormous aircraft that carried it. The carrier aircraft was, by definition, a perfect target. Think about it for a moment. A colossal aircraft, heavy, slow, forced to maintain a constant speed and altitude in order to launch and recover its fighters, with no possibility of maneuvering sharply, with no possibility of diving to escape, with no possibility of breaking formation, trapped by its own mission, exposed in the sky like a flying building. Enemy fighters did not need to be especially fast or especially skilled to bring it down. They only needed to find it. And an aircraft of that size was not exactly difficult to detect. And here lies the most brutal paradox of this entire concept. The carrier aircraft transported inside its fuselage not only its own crew members, but also the pilots of the fighters that had not yet been launched. If the carrier ship was shot down before completing its deployment, everyone died. Full crew, full pilots, full fighters, everything destroyed in a single impact. The system that had been designed to multiply striking power instead concentrated all vulnerability into a single point. A single point that was enormous, slow, and visible from kilometers away. Military strategists took years to admit it openly. They had invested too much money, too much time, too many lives during the testing phase. Acknowledging failure meant accepting that a brilliant idea on paper could be an absolute disaster in the reality of combat. But technology did not wait for the strategists to make that decision. It made the decision for them. Because while engineers kept trying to solve the problems of the carrier aircraft, in other laboratories around the world, two technologies were being born that would make the entire concept completely obsolete overnight. The first was aerial refueling. The ability to transfer fuel from one aircraft to another while both were in flight solved in a single stroke the range problem that had given rise to this entire project. Suddenly, conventional fighter aircraft could fly enormous distances, refuel in the air, and continue toward targets that had previously been unreachable, with no need to be transported inside anything, with no need for microfighters, with no need for metal trapezes or impossible maneuvers at 10,000 meters above the ground. The second technology was even more definitive. Long-range cruise missiles changed forever the nature of strikes at a distance. Suddenly, it was possible to launch a projectile from an aircraft that remained hundreds of kilometers from the target, beyond the reach of any enemy defense, and hit with a precision that no human pilot could ever match. Without risking a single life. Without needing to penetrate defended airspace. Without needing to transport aircraft inside aircraft. The carrier aircraft was not defeated by the enemy. It was defeated by the future. And that is, perhaps, the most powerful lesson of this entire story. Not the story of the technological failure itself, but what that failure teaches us about how military innovation, and human innovation in general, truly works. The boldest ideas of any era do not die because they are bad ideas. They die because the world advances faster than they do. Because while someone is trying to perfect a complex solution to a specific problem, another mind somewhere else finds a completely different solution that eliminates the problem entirely. The men who designed the carrier aircraft were not misguided visionaries. They were visionaries trapped in the present of their own time, as we all are. They saw a real problem, proposed a courageous solution, paid an enormous price in lives and resources trying to make it work, and in the end were overtaken not by their mistakes, but by the unstoppable advance of history. The sky they tried to conquer with those impossible machines was conquered by others, with tools they could not even have imagined. And that, at its core, is exactly what makes aviation great. Not the ideas that succeeded, but the courage of those who dared to attempt the ones that did not.